Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, students, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening plenary session of the 12th International Congress on the Archaeology of the Ancient Near East, being held under so far unprecedented circumstances. My name is Roger Matthews from the University of Reading, and I'm honored and delighted to be chairing this morning's opening plenary sessions. Let me begin by introducing Professor Francesco Ubertini, Rector of the Alma Mater Studiorum, University of Bologna, for his welcome greeting.
Honorable ambassadors connected today, dear colleagues and dear students, it's my great pleasure and privilege to be here today with you at the opening of the 12th International Congress on the Archaeology of the Ancient Near East, held in Italy for the third time since its inception in 1998. I must acknowledge that this happens today under exceptional circumstances, which exacted a heaviest toll from all of us. But the very fact that you are here in the hundreds today with us testifies to your resilience and determination. This forum of yours transcends political divisions among people and countries. It aims at being a place where ideas are traded and challenged so that they can be tested and applied to define both our common historical roots as well as new policies for taking proper care of our shared heritage. The last 20 years witnessed extraordinary damage to the heritage of the region, not to mention the humanitarian suffering, and I'm confident you will find and discuss new ways of healing it during this week. We in Bologna believe since 1088 in open science, in the absence of borders of all kinds, in the need to listen and to respect, but also to break free, to freely give knowledge to those who search for it, to educate and pass the torch to the next generation, in a trial of teachers who had their voices heard on the most competitive floor we have, that of our peers, and of the students who choose us for guidance and counseling. You share with us these core values, and this is why you convene today together. Science knows only personal honesty and systemic doubt. Most important, science needs to be practiced together. Cooperation among countries must be carried out in a spirit of inclusion and humility. No one can thrive alone. We strive for gender balance, but we must still acknowledge that at the University of Bologna, if women are more than half of our postdocs and half of our assistant professors, then they become a bit less than half of the associate professors and a mere 37% of full professors. Your thriving scientific community seems to me an example of a space where the glass ceiling has long been broken. The incentives you have are certainly not material ones. The task to which you dedicate your lives is a daunting one. The more so in a society vowed to destructing heritage in the name of profit, and still you are unceasing in your quest for preserving our past for future generations. Be you citizens of the Near East or foreigners who transfer their lives in countries which they have elected as second homes. For all these reasons, I salute you today with special gratitude and admiration. You should have visited our beautiful city and open university already last year. But the pandemic, which has which has come to redefine our lives, suggested we postpone the event of 1 year in the hope of meeting each other in person. And here we are, remotely. My enthusiasm for Bologna and the other 4 historic cities of our multi-campus system stems from their reception and openness towards people coming from the outside, like is my case, and like what would have been undoubtedly your case if the health situation did not prevent from all of this. So here I am to invite you to travel to Bologna at the earliest possible occasion, to visit our historical libraries, our fresco halls, our monumental courtyards, and our many university museums, but especially to discover the will to cooperate of our professors and to learn of our students. The city will open itself to you during busy days and nights, filled with cultural events animated by our more than 85,000 students, its urban fabric beating at the same rhythm of our millennial history. We could not yet seat you in our aula magna, nor invite you to dinner in the city palace of Re Enzo in the very city center of Bologna. Let me then conclude with a short video which we prepare for motivating your next scientific trip to Bologna. We heartily welcome you today virtually, as we will do when we will finally meet in person. I wish you a fruitful scientific meeting and the joys of dialogue and discovery of new data, but also of new people. Thank you and enjoy the meeting.
Thank you very much, Professor Ubertini. I'm sure a great many of us will be all too willing to accept your kind suggestion of visiting your beautiful city or revisiting your beautiful city as soon as it becomes possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now I would like to introduce for his inaugural greeting, Professor Ingolf Thuesen from the University of Copenhagen, President of the ICAANE International Scientific Committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Matthews, and Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. For more than a year, we have experienced one of the major disruptions of social life in our time. The pandemic is still pulling a track of death and suffering through our world. As Near Eastern archaeologists, we are not in the front line fighting the virus and its mutations, but we are there in order to contribute to the rehabilitation of the rich and important heritage of the Middle East as soon as possible. And therefore this ICAANE is more important than ever. More than 23 years ago, we opened the first international conference on the archaeology of the ancient Near East. It was launched in Rome in 1998 as a result of a visionary initiative by our colleague Professor Paolo Mattia. The first ICAANE attracted around 150 participants. The 12th ICAANE, which we launched today, has attracted around 1,000 scholarly contributions from more than 40 countries around the world. These numbers alone show the relevance and importance of the conference and its success. Near Eastern archaeology is among the highest internationally profiled branches of archaeology for many good reasons. First of all, West Asia and North Africa is one of the richest regions in archaeology and history in the world. And in this region, we can observe the cultural evolution leading to farming and sedentary life and formation of urban settlement and early kingdoms and empires. This region connects the Eurasian and African continents, and it's the western section of a belt of early civilizations developing more than 5,000 years ago and stretching from the East Mediterranean to China. We can see ourselves today as a product of the pioneering and crucial innovations that took place in this belt of early civilization. As archaeologists, we study the physical remains of the processes that brought humankind away from hunter-gatherer societies through village farmers to urban life in highly advanced societies. The evolution advanced by the development of a long-distance trade, technological innovation, and not at least by the acknowledgement of the importance of science and art. Therefore, University of Bologna, the oldest still functioning university in the world, founded almost 1,000 years ago, is the ideal host for the ICAANE. And we are grateful to its leadership and Rector, Professor Francesco Ubertini, for the courage to insist on organizing the ICAANE despite of impossible circumstances caused by the pandemic. Archaeology begins in the field with excavations. Excavations are normally carried out as a teamwork, including scientists from several different disciplines and faculties. After the fieldwork, the interpretation of discovery follows at universities and research institutions based on a dialogue between colleagues. And therefore we open the 12th ICAANE today. Near Eastern archaeology rests on dialogues between colleagues. We share and exchange in order to improve our understanding, and finally we share our gained insight into the ancient Near Eastern civilizations to our contemporary society through exhibitions, books, and other media. More than a year ago, the world society was hit by a catastrophic pandemic, causing human suffering worldwide. Nothing has been the same for more than a year. Lockdowns have closed universities and museums. Teaching and research has been done from home using online platforms. Fieldwork has become almost impossible. And archaeologists not being able to go into the field is like a fish without water. Normally, excavations in the Middle East are long-term projects with annual field season. The disruption of these routines deeply affects our research and may also leave sites unattended and exposed to deterioration due to lack of preservation and maintenance. I therefore urge the decision makers to take this into consideration when the world begins to reopen. When this pandemic, hopefully soon, has come under control, we shall enter a phase of rehabilitation of our academic routines. In such a rehabilitation phase, the academic dialogue and the dialogue with decision makers and dialogue with the local people where we carry out fieldwork will become of highest importance. Not only the pandemic requires our return to the fields. Unfortunately, large regions in the Middle East are suffering from armed conflict or the lack of functioning infrastructure and resources for antiquity management as a result of armed conflicts. Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon are severely affected and need all our concern and aid. And therefore, this ICAANE, the 12th ICAANE, is not only important, but it's absolutely necessary. This week we meet and initiate the rebuilding of our routines as Near Eastern archaeologists in order to make our best contribution to the rehabilitation of the heritage of the Middle East. Online is the only format possible for the 12th ICAANE, but I'm convinced I represent every one of the around 1,000 archaeologists who signed up for a meeting in Bologna in expressing our deepest appreciation of the University of Bologna and the team led by Professor Nicolò Marchetti for making this possible, and for taking up the challenge of changing the format away from an on-site conference. It must have been an organizational nightmare to be forced to make difficult decisions with very short notice and often with unpredictable consequences. We admire the strength and determination of the University of Bologna and Nicolò Marchetti and his team in stating that there's no alternative to the 12th ICAANE, not even a pandemic. For good reasons, University of Bologna is assumed to be the oldest of first still functioning university worldwide. University of Bologna never gives up. Thank you, Bologna. Thank you, Nicolò, and your team for making this possible. 4 days with hundreds of exciting presentations are ahead of us. We have been looking forward to this since the successful 11th ICAANE in Munich in 2018. We shall all miss the spectacular setting of the conference in beautiful Bologna, and we shall miss talking to old and new friends and colleagues in the coffee bars in between sessions. But we shall not miss the substance of the conference, sharing discoveries and results of our fascinating discipline, Near Eastern archaeology, and preparing ourselves for future on-site in the field and in the laboratories and at conferences. On behalf of the International Scientific Committee, I welcome you to a historic 12th ICAANE online, and I wish all of you a fruitful 12th ICAANE. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Thuesen. I'm sure all of the Congress delegates echo your sentiments, your very cogent comments there. Thank you very much. I'm now delighted to introduce two institutional greetings. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Professor Paolo Capuzzo, Head of the Department of History and Cultures, Alma Mater Studiorum, University of Bologna. Please.
Thank you, Roger, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to this virtual meeting. I wanted just to convey the most cordial greetings of our Department of History and Culture to this huge conference. It's pity you couldn't reach Bologna for this event, but I understand we have to go ahead with our scientific activity in spite of this pandemic. I will not get into the scientific content of the conference. By the way, I'm a historian of the 20th century, so nobody is perfect. But there are some issues at stake within these 8 themes of this conference which go well beyond the academic exchange between experts of archaeological research on the ancient Near East. All themes are challenging and very interesting, but let me remind some of them which involve fundamental issues of our contemporary world. Changing climate and exploitation strategies. We can learn a lot from the ancient world on the impact of the climate change on ecology, landscapes, and material culture. The whole discussion on open data approach is crucial nowadays. How to share and manage research data, how to work cooperatively, how to communicate our research results promptly and in an accessible way. Endangered cultural heritage, research, conservation, and development strategies in order to face with threats to heritage in the Near East. This is an issue our research teams here in Bologna had to face with. Research fostering must be coupled with steady dialogue with the political and cultural agenda of the countries in which we work, in order to develop a mutual cooperation and the shared vision of priorities. And finally, last but not least, I would also remind the very form of this conference, the technological challenge represented by moving a so huge meeting to the virtual sphere. I think this is also an experience from which to take advantage in order to strengthen in the future the networks of our academic exchange. Nevertheless, and I join the address of our Rector Francesco Ubertini, I warmly encourage you to come to Bologna once it will be possible. Both the city and our universities are worth to be visited at some point, believe me. Our department is developing archaeological excavation and research in Italy, in Europe, and of course, in the Near East. We invested a lot, and recent recruitments has strengthened our potentiality in this area. At the moment, we are active in many countries. My colleagues have been working in Turkey, Egypt, Oman, Iran, Iraq, Uzbekistan, Pakistan. It's an exciting, although difficult work, because of the hardships experienced by some of these countries in the last decades. For all these reasons, I have to thank warmly the organizing committee and the administrative staff which has made this conference possible, and particularly my friend Professor Nicolò Marchetti for promoting and coordinating the realization of this conference. So I wish you an enjoyable, full and successful conference. Good luck with your work.
Thank you very much, Professor Capuzzo. And for our second institutional greeting, it is our pleasure now to hear from Professor Adriano Rossi, President of the International Association for Mediterranean and Oriental Studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Matthews. Rector Magnificus, distinguished authorities, dear colleagues, I'm delighted to bring to the participants of the 12th International Congress on the Archaeology of the Ancient Near East the warmest greetings of ISMEO, the International Association of Mediterranean and Oriental Studies, an international association which currently counts over 300 scholars, including 120 eminent foreign correspondents, in ideal representation of more than 100 universities, research centers, and academic, scientific, and museum institutions from all over the world. I don't need to stress ISMEO's extreme satisfaction without being able to provide a partnership to this magnificent event that honors one of the oldest universities in the world, the alma mater that hosts us today. Of course, the merit of the organization, an organization which seems impeccable to me and which is almost incredible in these months of considerable restrictions to our professional and personal lives, goes entirely to the alma mater, its Department of History and Cultures, and the tireless Professor Nicolò Marchetti, to whom we will never be grateful enough. The International Association ISMEO, refounded in Rome in 2012, has intended to reconnect even through its denomination to the Institute for the Middle and Far East, founded in the 1930s by Giuseppe Tucci. And many of its members were and are interested in different ways to the world which has represented one of its main research interests carried on during the years, that is, that of the cultures of the Iranian plateau, and particularly the irradiation of these cultures towards Central Asia, the Gulf, and the Indian subcontinent, and the connections between these regions and the Mesopotamian plain. Several times I have evoked in Iran and in Italy the trips that Enrico Mattei and Giuseppe Tucci made in Iran at the end of the 1950s. Iran's gratitude for the egalitarian openness that first in the world Enrico Mattei proposed in the division of oil revenues produced the conditions for an intensified Italian cultural presence in Middle East. The first archaeological mission in Iran, led by Giorgio Gullini and Umberto Scerrato, had the aim of a systematic reconnaissance of Sistan. The Italian scholars intended to individuate the most promising sites, whose excavation could permit to verify all cultural phases since prehistory to the Islamic times. The Haneya Goleman, discovered among the dunes in the area of the Sanarud by Professor Umberto Scerrato, is possibly to be identified with the capital city of the Achaemenid satrapy of Dranghiana. The excavations went on during the 60s and early 70s, bringing to light a settlement with monumental buildings, and these first researches were subsequently continued by younger Iranian archaeologists. Shahre-Sorte is one of the largest metropolises of the third millennium BCE. Its identification is due to Professor Maurizio Tosi, who led there an Italian-Iranian team from 1967 to 1978. Through new information technology and increasing availability of satellite images, large architectural structures are now recognizable thanks to the wall alignments, as well as smaller plans such as residential neighborhood homes. Recent excavations, both Italian and Iranian, are exhibiting large urban buildings of monumental dimensions. To actual archaeological excavations, ISMEO ISIAO accompanied a great deal of restoration activities at Takht-e Jamshid, Pazargadi, and on different monuments of Islamic art. We consider the still unpublished documentary mass that derives from those works as a common heritage of Iran, Italy, and the world. And the new ISMEO recognizes as its duty to make available to international scholars many of its experiences and data remained for different reasons unpublished so far. What I have said will help to make it clear in what sense we are extremely pleased that the 12th edition of the International Congress on Archaeology of Ancient Near East is the first whose organization has actively involved ISMEO. And also for this reason, the participation of Iranian scholars has reached record levels. It's not coincidence that of the 24 different ISMEO archaeological missions and projects currently active in Asia and Africa, 4 concerned important research in as many areas of Iran, and that together with Iranian archaeological authorities, ISMEO has organized in December 2019 an exhibition on the 60 years of archaeological collaborations between the two countries, which illustrated over 40 Italian-Iranian projects carried out from the 1950s to the present day. In this spirit, once again thanking all those who have worked for the success of this great event, I wish all participants good work and fruitful scientific discussions. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Rossi. It is an honor now to introduce my long-standing colleague and friend, chair of the 12th ICAANE Organizing Committee, who with his team has carried the considerable weight of the Congress organization and the unprecedented attendant uncertainties on his shoulders for the past several years. Professor Nicolò Marchetti, Alma Mater Studiorum, University of Bologna, will now provide an introduction and opening of the Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honorable ambassadors, dear colleagues, it's my honor today to open this long-awaited meeting of ours, the 12th ICAANE. It's many of you today with us. We have 850 registered participants from 43 countries, and I'm only counting in these rough stats the first authors of papers. When I tell you that we have a perfect equality, as our rector, Professor Ubertini, hinted, we have a perfect 50% of first presenters between women and men. And from this map, you can see where Middle Eastern studies are thriving in the world. We can do better. This was a terrible year. We lost 3 of our registered participants, Gregory Oreshian, Michelle Casanova, and Anish Shaya, plus many other colleagues, of course, outside of our ICAANE community. They will be remembered in the closing session. Professor Cagliari is organizing a collection of speeches about them, which is something we really owe them for their work, for their friendship, for their warmth. In fact, in these days, I am very much stressed by many emails that I'm getting from colleagues infected with COVID. They are struggling. They had to cancel their papers. Of course, all our wishes are with them. You will overcome. We are looking forward to reading you in the proceedings. So go on, don't give up. We had to go remote. There was no chance of keeping the in-presence person as we hoped staunchly for 1 year. The search on companies providing 2 platforms, the StreamYard platform where we are broadcasting now, which is reserved only for speakers, for presenters, and the Hybrida.io, where you can follow live the whole Congress with its parallel sessions by clicking into the program live entry of the menu in Hybrida. Of course, speaking from a remote platform is familiar to most of us by now. We will not be able to enjoy what we have seen in Professor Ubertini's presentation, but there are also a few, at least, upsides. By recording the sessions, we will be able to attend the integrality of the ICAANE, which has never been the case, of course, because the parallel sessions forced us to sometimes painful choices. But especially, we are very pleased that we reached an agreement. And since Monday, so since the end of the conference, we will allow registered professors and students from the Middle East and elsewhere to look at the videos. This is the first time that an immense community of people having, for example, difficulty to travel can attend almost real-time cutting-edge research on a heritage which in the first place, it's a universal heritage, but it's also their heritage. So inclusivity has always been the keyword for the ICAANE meetings. And by disseminating our results, we are fulfilling one of our main duties. The 11 preceding ICAANE, 10 of them have been published and 1 even on open access already. And I'm very happy that Harasovitz agreed with us that the proceedings of this ICAANE will be published in golden open access. This, again, is something very important for bringing our work, our results to a wider community of students in the first place. The region we are dealing with, we are living in, has been in a very harsh 2 decades. The last 2 decades were a disaster for looting, for heritage. Many distractions affect, in the first place, people, but also heritage, both from war situations and from intentional distractions. But of course, we should not forget that other threats are looming. Climate change will affect severely, for example, the rising sea levels, southern Iraq, the Nile Delta, and I think our community needs to reflect and to prepare for this moment. the urgency of the situation has been reflected in the teams that have been selected for the 12th ICAANE. So we have some traditional areas like the field reports where we have been always present, and environmental archaeology. Material culture, of course, is one of the core businesses of archaeologists. And also we think that in post-processual approach, cognitive archaeology is a fundamental thing to investigate. But of course, we need models. Modeling the past, it means that we encourage a theoretical debate about how to model these complex behavioral patterns. And network archaeology is basically what we are doing more and more. So working together on shared priorities and research objects. And endangered cultural heritage, of course, due to the last developments, is also most urgent. And Islamic archaeology has since been with us. We have become a large forum because everything is so interrelated. In the global view of current archaeology, we cannot limit ourselves to strict disciplinary or subdisciplinary boundaries. We are concerned with a region, with its problems of conservation, of interpretation, and of course, we are advocating for a way of working together. So the green path, which you see here, is the most successful. We believe this is the best avenue for having a fruitful academic cooperations. And now finally, it's my pleasant duty to acknowledge those who have been instrumental in the organization of this Congress. Of course, in the first place, the Rector of Bologna University, Francesco Ubertini, and the Deputy Rector, Mirko degli Esposti. Mirko was so important in handling the health situation, the health emergency we had and we are having. Michele Cainiello, head of the Department of Law, gave us the spaces which would have made possible an ICAANE in presence, the only spaces we had of this kind, where we are now roaming alone. But without this possibility, we couldn't have proposed Bologna as a seat, so we were grateful to Michele. And Paolo Capuzzo, the head of my department, whom you just heard, believed since the very beginning that this was not folly, but was a useful undertaking. So, and ISMEO, since the beginning, again, decided to support us, believing in this kind of cooperation, and have been so important, especially, for example, for Iranian colleagues, as Professor Rossi told us. Fondazione Alma Mater took care of a technical organization with Alessandro Veritz basically popping on everything on the table. Bologna would have welcomed you in Bologna, but they will in the future. And our sponsor, the Gelato Museum of Carpigiani and Iperceramica, they gave some cash prizes for participants, which you find announced in the Congress website, 12icaane.unibo.it. The academic publishers here with us, they have an expo area in the platform, and they are greeting participants with special offers and so on, but especially we like them because they like us. I mean, publication is the only best and main way we have to share our results. They support this mission of ours, so we are very grateful that they are here again with us. The organizing committee, my colleagues here, they are all from the University of Bologna with the addition of Adriano Rossi. They were so enthusiastic since the beginning. They come from areas sometimes totally within the ICAANE interest, sometimes on the fringes, from prehistory, from late antiquity, from the proto-history of the Italian peninsula, from Egyptology, of course, and Assyriology and so on. But they have been united as a team in supporting us. The Scientific Advisory Board was especially tasked with many petty but most important tasks about the scientific organization. So I am very grateful to all my friends and colleagues who supported us in this very difficult, especially last year. The International Committee honored us with the trust of entrusting to Bologna the organization of the 12th ICAANE. I remain very grateful for this extension of trust. We will do our best to be up until the end of the publication of the proceedings, when we will finally relieved officially of this burden. But nothing of this would have been possible without a team of dedicated young scholars who basically work for free, so we are doubly grateful to them. You see their names here. There are no words I have for praising their commitment, their enthusiasm, their willingness to solve hassles and problems, which, as you can imagine, abound every day. So finally, we are here for having a nice week together, scientific exchanges, and we all together in Bologna University and the ICAANE community, we can finally convene and the Congress is officially open. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Marchetti. I'm sure all the Congress delegates will join me in expressing our sincere gratitude and appreciation to you and all the 12th ICAANE Organizing Committee for the huge amount of work and attention you have devoted to providing us with what will surely be a thoroughly memorable and rewarding Congress. So I believe we are ready to go now to our poetry reading. I would like to introduce Dr. Ahmad Addous, who will in turn introduce our 4 readers of Hymn of the Rain, Unshudat al-Matar, by Badr Shākir Al-Sayyāb. Please, over to you, Dr. Ahmad.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Matteo. We are honored to be here, me and a small group of students. We are delighted to start the 12th International Congress works on the archaeology of the ancient Near East with a poem, with what's often considered as the highest expression of a human language, and normally it has a special place in our life, and nobody, I think, live without it. We chose a poet, Badr Shākir Al-Sayyāb, Iraqi by birth, but in reality, his lyric poetry is as universal as the music. His poems, with the small group, with other works of a small group of Iraqi poets, mark the introduction of a free verse in modern Arabic poetry after 15 centuries of rigorous poetic traditional of a classical verse with his strict metric rules. Al-Sayyāb, besides classical Arabic literature influences, he was strongly inspired by English poets of T.S. Eliot's school. He studied and deeply admired, in particular, the works of Dylan Thomas and Edith Sitwell. The piece you'll hear shortly was selected from the collection, which was published in 1961 and entitled Hymn of the Rain, or in another translation, The Rain Song, or The Song of the Rain. In this collection, the free versification reached supreme maturity. In it, he renews the poetic language, and he also draws on a rich repertoire of historical motifs and methods of different civilizations that are elaborated through a technical and linguistic application of a high lyrical level. This is one of the reasons why this collection has become a touchstone of modern Arabic literature. Al-Sayyāb, despite his untimely death in 1964 at the age of 38 years old, produced 7 collections of poetry and several translations, which include the poetry of Nazim Hikmat, Rilke, Tagore, Rimbaud, Louis Aragon, Montale, Pablo Neruda, Garcia Lorca, Sitwell, Eliot, and many others. Hymn of the Rain was written in a rhythm of Raj's meter, very similar to the iambic syllabic foot, and shows a considerable technical skill. Every foot is composed of a long double syllable, followed by a short and then a long one, whose melodic rhythm sound like this: dom dom do dom, or do dom do dom. Of course, it's not easy to hear it in translation, but it's possible by following the original text in Arabic. Our readers, it's very important, are a quartet composed of 4 magnificent students, 3 from the University of Bologna, Giulia, Alice, and Margherita, and one from the Institute, Oriental Institute of Naples, Roberto. I think they have a lot of passion and enthusiasm for 3 languages they are learning: Arabic, Farsi, and Turkish. Well, here they are, the voice of the beauty. Thank you very much indeed, and enjoy listening.
Unshudatul Matar.
Hymn of the Rain by Badr Shākir Al-Sayyāb.
عيناك غابة نخيل ساحة السهر أو شرفتان راح ينهان مع القمر. عيناك حين تبسمان تريك الكروم وترقص الأضواء كالأقمار في النهر. يرجه المجدف وهنان ساحة السهر كأنما تنبيد في غاورهما النجوم.
Your eyes are palm trees forests in early light, or balconies from which the moonlight recedes. When they smile, your eyes, the vines put forth their leaves, and lights dance like moons in a river, rippled by the blade of an oar at break of day, as if stars were throbbing in the depths of them. وتراكان في ضباب مناس شفيف كالبحر سرها اليدين فوقه المساء دفء الشتاء فيه وارتعاشة الخريف والموت والميلاد والظلام والضياء.
And day drawn in a mist of sorrow translucent, like the sea, stroked by the hand of nightfall. The warmth of winter is in it, the shadow of autumn, and death, and birth, darkness, and light. فتستفيق ميل روحي رشة البكاء ونشوة وشية تعانق السماء كنشوة الطفل إذا خاف من القمر كان أكواس السحاب تشبر يوم وكثرة فكثرة تذوب في المطر وكركر الأطفال في عرايش الكروم ودردرت صمت سافر على الشجر. أنشودة المطر. مطر
مطر.
مطر.
A sobbing flares up to tremble in my soul, and a savage elation embracing the sky, frenzy of a child frightened by the moon. It is as if archways of mist drank the clouds, and drop by drop dissolved in the rain, as if children snickered in the vineyard bowers. The song of the rain rippled the silence of birds in the trees. Rain.
Still falls the rain.
Still falls the rain.
Esnedi akşam ve kara bulutların kederli gözyaşları akıyor hala. Sanki bir çocuk uykudan önce sayıklamaya başlıyor. Bir yıldır uyandığında bulamadığı, sonra sormayı direttiğinde de yarından sonra döner dedikleri annesi muhakkak dönmeli. Bir de arkadaşları fısıldayınca ona annesinin tepe yamacında ölüm uykusunu uyuduğunu, kabrin toprağından beslenip suyundan içtiğini, o zaman sanki mazlum bir balıkçı ağlarını toplar, küfreder suya ve kadere, şarkıyı saçar ay battığında. Yağmur, yağmur, yağmur.
Evening yawned from low clouds. Heavy tears are streaming still. It is as if a child before sleep were rambling on, About his mother a year ago, he went to wake her, did not find her, then was told, for he kept on asking, after tomorrow she'll come back again, that she must come back again. Yet his playmates whisper that she is there, in the hillside, sleeping her death forever, eating the earth around her, drinking the rain, as if a forlorn fisherman gathering nets, curse the waters and fate, and scatter the song at moonset. Still falls the rain, still falls the rain.
هیچ می‌دانی که این باران چه اندوهی برمی‌انگیزد و چه ناله‌ای از نو تنها بلند می‌کند و مرد تنها را چه حسی از گمشدگی فرا می‌گیرد بی انتها، مثل خون جاری، مثل گرسنگی، مثل عشق، مثل بچه‌ها، مرده‌ها. چنین است باران و چشمانت خمرخمان است در باران و برگ‌هایی که بر فراز خلیج می‌درخشند سواحل عراق را با ستاره‌ها و صدف جلا می‌دهند. گویی شفق در تب و تاب رخایی است، اما شب روی آن پرده‌ای می‌کشد از خون و من به سوی خلیج فریاد می‌زنم: ای خلیج، ای بخشنده مروارید و صدف و مرگ، و صدا برمیگردد چون ناله‌ای سنگین: ای خلیج، ای بخشنده صدف و مرگ.
Do you know what sorrow the rain can inspire? Do you know how gutters weep when it pours down? Do you know how lost a solitary person feels in the rain? Endless, like spilled blood, like hungry people, like love, like children, like the dead, endless the rain. Your eyes take me wandering with the rain. Lightnings from across the gulf sweep the shores of Iraq with stars and shells as if a dawn were about to break from them, but night pulls over them a coverlet of blood. I cry out to the Gulf, O Gulf, giver of pearls, shells, and death. And the echo replies, as if lamenting, O Gulf, giver of shells and death.
وفي العراق جو وينثر الرلال فيه موسم الحصاد لتشبه الغربان والجراد وتتنى الشوان والأجار راها تدور في كل أولاها بشر مطر
Matter.
مطر.
And there is hunger in Iraq. The harvest time scatters the granite, that crows and locusts may gobble their fill. Granaries and stones grind on and on. Mills turn in the fields, with them men turning. Rain.
Still falls the rain.
Still falls the rain. وكم درفنا ليلة الرحيل من دموع ثم تللنا خوفا نلام بالمطر.
مطر.
Matter.
When came the night for leaving, how many tears we shed. We made the rain a pretext, not wishing to be blamed.
Still falls the rain.
Still falls the rain. ومنذ أن كنا صغارا كانت السماء تغيم في الشتاء ويهطل المطر وكلها حين يشب آثر نجوه ممرام والعراق ليس فيه جو مطر
Matter.
مطر.
Since we had been children, the sky would be cloudy in winter time, and down would pour the rain. And every year, when earth turned green, the hunger struck us. Not a year has passed without hunger in Iraq. Rain.
Still falls the rain.
Still falls the rain. في كل كثرة من المطر حمراء أو صفراء من جنة الزهر وكل دمعات من الجياع واللراء وكل كثرة تراق من دم أبيد فهي بتسام في انتظار موسم جديد أو هلمات توردت على فم وليد في عالم غد الفتي واهب ليا مطر
Matar.
مطر.
In every drop of rain, a red or yellow color buds from the seeds of flowers. Every tear wept by the hungry and naked people, and every spilt drop of slave's blood is a smile aimed at a new dawn, a nipple turning rosy in an infant's lips, in the young world of tomorrow, bringer of life. Rain.
Still falls the rain.
Still falls the rain.
falls the rain.
Thank you very much to Dr. Ahmad and Giulia, Margherita, Roberto, and Alice for that very moving rendition in those beautiful languages of Unshudat al-Matar. Now, to close the opening addresses and artistic performances, I'd like to introduce Réda Zine, who will give us a musical interlude reviewing the Middle East and North Africa musical heritage, Guana music from Guembre to electric guitar. Over to you, Réda. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, and thank you for this opportunity. My name is Réda, and I'm broadcasting live and direct from home in Bologna, Italy. I'm a musician and filmmaker originally from Casablanca, Morocco, where I started my interest in music and arts. I had the chance to travel around the globe and meet with different artists, especially in the MENA region, from Tunis to Cairo, from Baghdad to Amman or Beirut. Had to appreciate the work that you archaeologists doing to preserve human heritage. In some way, the music I'm bringing today is part of my identity. So the Gembri, also called Sentir, Hejhouj, and many different ways across the West, North Africa, and some Middle Eastern countries. It's part of cultural heritage and ancient healing and trance music brought with sub-Saharan slaves to North Africa, mixing it with their animist cultures with local dominant Sufi Muslim influences during at least the past 5 documented centuries. The origin of this very old both strings and the percussion musical instrument made by goat strings, camel neck skins, and wood might be linked to the ancient Zar music, tambura, from the ancient Egypt civilizations. Today I'm using a loop station which allow me to record different musical layers and interpret one of the first Gnawa song called Shalaban, which is part of the large spiritual Gnawa patrimony brought from Middle East and East Africa to West, then North Africa. Oh, yeah. We're running off the time, so we went on fade out from the first track, Shalaban, to the next one. I have the pleasure to introduce you, called Amal, which means hope in Arabic. That's also the name of my little daughter, born during this lockdown era. So I salute you with a very short frame from this Amal, hope song. Thank you for watching. Have a great work. See you soon, hopefully live. Thank you again. Bye.
Very much, Réda. I was quite tempted to get my electric guitar out and jam along with you, actually, but didn't quite have the time. So that completes our opening addresses and artistic performances. Thank you to all our speakers who've given us such a warm welcome, as best as one can in the online environment, of course. Now we move to our keynote lectures. I'm honored to chair this session as well. Each of our keynote lectures will address one of the major themes of 12 ICAANE. And we begin with a lecture on the theme of field reports by Professor Adelheid Otto of Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich. A new response to old questions. How did Ur slowly recover in the Isin-Lhasa period? Please, Professor Otto.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, I am honored to open the keynote session of this historical first remote ICAANE. This conference with 4 full days of virtual exchange will be different, and I regret deeply that we cannot meet personally in Bologna, this pearl of Italy. However, in these times of constraint and isolation, it is even more important that we get and stay connected. Professor Nicolò Marchetti and his team have organized this conference thanks to Herculean efforts, or let's say Gilgamesh and Enkidu efforts, struggling with countless problems popping up at every corner, a bit like the 7-headed snake, but never losing their faith that the ICAANE must go on. When we met for the last ICAANE 3 years ago, I experienced how challenging it was to organize a normal ICAANE. How much more challenging must this organization have been? In the name of all participants, I would like to thank Nicolò Marchetti and his team from my deepest heart that he made this impossible ICAANE possible for the benefit of all of us. The fieldwork session is again the largest. We will have more than 100 papers and posters on fieldwork in the vast area from Cyprus in the west to Afghanistan in the east, and from Uzbekistan in the north to Yemen in the south. This is proof how active our field is and that research goes on despite any kind of difficulties. When I was asked to give a keynote on field reports, I wondered why a keynote should address this clear-cut topic. Since then, I have found some answers. First, Fieldwork is not only a crucial part of archaeological research, it is also today more important than ever. Whole archaeological landscapes are endangered. They suffer severe damage by the rapid growth of infrastructural development, agriculture, or criminal energy, all leading to the irreversible loss of our cultural heritage. The pace of destruction is alarming. It is our task to develop sustainable field projects in order to protect and save as much as possible of the cultural heritage. I believe that our fieldwork projects, when conducted in close cooperation with the local authorities and communities, can be an efficient step into this direction. Many of the Middle Eastern countries are presently suffering from armed conflicts, political instability, too little humanitarian support, and missing perspectives for the future. But even people in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and other much threatened countries can regain strength and hope from the outstanding past of their countries. Due to the generosity of the inviting countries, archaeologists from all over the world are helping to unearth the fascinating past of the Near East. Whoever is entrusted with the investigation of an ancient site should be grateful for this chance, but should also feel responsible for the site, its past and future, and for the dissemination of the results also within the relevant country. The second point I want to emphasize here is to explain a new trend in fieldwork, that is the re-investigation of sites which had been excavated already a long time ago. I totally agree with those of you who excavate new, so far unknown sites, that it is most exciting to unveil slowly the hidden past of a site, its kind, structure, and possibly even its ancient name and history. I counted 70 papers about excavations or surveys of new sites during this ICAANE. 10,000 of sites are still hidden under the earth, and generations of archaeologists will have the chance to disclose their secrets if damage to them will be prevented. On the other hand, there are dozens of famous sites where excavations had been conducted in cases more than a century ago. Some of them have become the key sites for understanding the Near Eastern past and mankind's cultural heritage. Without them, our insight into the past living, working, and thinking would be much poorer, despite the fact that the methods in former times were quite different from today. Not only the times and our way of behaving have changed, including the former colonial attitude of many so-called Western excavators. But above all, the methods and the technical possibilities have radically changed. Remote sensing, geophysical prospections, IT technologies, 3D imaging, microanalytical techniques, and the whole range of scientific methods have opened completely new pathways through the jungle of the hidden past. But also our questions have changed. Earlier excavations often concentrated on royal palaces, treasures found in graves, or temples which promised rich finds. But all too often, we know little about the former life of the people. What was their diet? How healthy were they? How did humans respond to the challenges of climatic, environmental, and political conditions? And how was the daily life not only of men, but also of women, children, and slaves? Therefore, the recent trend for renewed excavation of an already known site is no lack of ideas, but the attempt to solve open questions with the enormous arsenal of modern methods and to address new questions to seemingly well-known sites. Let me show you with this case study how renewed excavations, even on a small scale, can help to answer old questions. More precisely, I will address the question how Ur survived the well-known catastrophic destruction at the end of the Ur-3 period and recovered in the early Old Babylonian or Isin-Lhasa period. Ur is clearly a key site for understanding ancient Mesopotamian society and culture. The famous excavations in the early 20th century, directed by Leonard Woolley on behalf of the British Museum London and the Penn Museum Philadelphia, with the finds distributed between the Iraq Museum Baghdad and the two mentioned museums, brought to light a major city which flourished for over 4,000 years due to its position near the Gulf and its character as an internationally important trade center on the one hand, and on the other hand because it remained the cultic center of the moon god Nana and his spouse Ningal for millennia. Ur was a global player already during the third millennium and finally outmatched our other powers during the Ur III period. Ur-Nama and his descendants rebuilt the cultic complex with temples, a palace, a storehouse, royal tombs, and the first ziggurat, the most impressive monument in southern Iraq until today. This prospering period, with Ur as the capital, lasted only for 100 years until it was destroyed by the Elamites and Ishbi-Eran of Isin. The destruction of Ur at the end of the Ur III period remained in the collective memory for centuries, as much later copies of the great literary texts, the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur, testify. However, the archaeological record gives no hint about how radical the destruction of the living quarters was, since only public buildings, but not a single private dwelling from Ur III date had been excavated so far, and no Ur III remains had been recorded from the South Mount, except from the city wall. The next impression that we all have in mind is the flourishing Old Babylonian city, especially the areas AH and EM, impressively large surfaces of domestic areas excavated by Woolley at a time already when large-scale excavation of living quarters were not only very much in vogue, they became the model of Mesopotamian urban domestic quarters. What you see here are composite maps of continuously inhabited dwellings. Many, but not all, of the houses looked like this in the time of Hammurabi, before the city came to a temporary halt under Samsu-Iluna. But of course, the houses did not pop up like this in the 18th century. Woolley dates his earliest phase of private houses to the earlier second millennium and mentions traces of late third millennium houses with a similar plan below, unfortunately without showing them. But had the domestic quarters lived on continuously after the Ur III destruction, or had there been a hiatus in the settlement history? This is one among many questions which led to the new Ur project of the team directed by Professor Elizabeth Stone from Stony Brook University. Due to the generous support by the SBAH and its former General Director Kais Rashid and the former Cultural Minister Dr. Abdelhamid Al-Hamdani, and following the invitation by Elizabeth Stone and Paul Szymanski, I was allowed to participate in the Ur project with a team from the University Munich from 2017 to 19. Financial support was granted by the Gerda Henkel Foundation. The teams working in areas 1 to 4, directed by Elizabeth Stone and Brad Hefford, encountered a continuous sequence of house levels below the uppermost Old Babylonian houses, going back to the Ur III, Akkadian, and even early dynastic period. If there was a gap in occupation after the Ur III period, it cannot have lasted long. But how about the other parts of the city? Was the whole South Mount settled in the Old Babylonian period? Only a small part of the South Mount has been investigated by Woolley, as you see on this map. To answer this question, we asked a team of LMU directed by Jörg Fassbinder and Marion Scheiblecker to conduct magnetometer prospection in 2017 and 19. It turned out that the Old Babylonian buildings can be distinguished quite easily from the Neo-Babylonian ones through magnetometry, since the mud brick walls from the first millennium buildings give different anomalies than the baked brick walls from the second millennium. Additional electric resistivity profiles produced further information about houses, the harbor with its quay wall, and the fortifications. The overall result is that the area inside the city wall was densely settled in the Old Babylonian period, although a few areas show no remains, at least in magnetometry. Following the geophysical prospection in 2017, Our team opened Area 5 on the South Mount, close to the southern edge of the city near the city wall, and as far as possible distant from AH, in order to investigate if there existed socially and economically different dwellings in the city center and at the periphery. The baked brick walls of an old Babylonian house appeared immediately below the sloping surface. Shallow remains of a first millennium building and some cassite walls had been preserved only in the most elevated area. The house turned out to be a spacious compound, regularly built and matching quite well Woolley's ideal type of a courtyard house. A row of rooms surrounded the courtyard, and an additional large room was secluded in the least accessible part of the house. Woolley would have called this the domestic chapel. The house measures 236 square meters, and consists of 16 rooms and a courtyard. It is surrounded by streets in the west and north, by a private lane in the east, and a large open space in the south. The ground plan is quite regular and nearly rectangular. The southwestern and southeastern sides form a perfect right angle and measure 16 meters each, that is 32 Babylonian cubits. Apparently, the well-planned house had not to respect other buildings, only the broad street in the northwest from where the house was entered. One feels that spacious building plots were available here. If we compare the size and number of rooms with other houses at Ur, our house is the largest and has the highest number of rooms, with the exception of number 11 Paternoster Row, which had more than 19 rooms and was interpreted as a khan by Woolley. The house was occupied during 3 phases. The date is derived through tablets and ceilings, but I cannot go into detail here. I will not speak about phases 2 and 3, but will concentrate on the first phase. In phase 1, the house was built, but after not too long a time, the house was abandoned and underwent massive change. It was divided into 2 parts, and the floor was raised with the help of an artificial fill. In phase 3, the house was altered again, and possibly most of it was eroded, transformed into a workshop before the area was abandoned, probably together with the rest of the city at the time of Samsu-Iluna. Let us now make a round tour through the house of phase 1. We start in the courtyard, enter the reception room through a broad door, go to the lavatory in the upper corner, return to archive room 4 and the adjacent room 5, and finish by the kitchen. An open fireplace was attached to the western side of the courtyard. Remains of fish give a hint to the most common diet at Ur, although sheep, pork, and beef was also consumed. The 3 supports probably served for grilling the fish, similar to how fish is grilled still today in the nearby marshes. Only a few days, in fact, before we excavated this fireplace, we had been invited in the marshes to a lovely grill fish with a similar installation. The reception room was divided into 2 parts. Each part was equipped with a basin-like installation. Basin 1 was probably used as a hearth. In front of basin 2 was lying a molded table-like object decorated with crawling snakes. Reddish and blackish traces testify to its use as an incense burner. Although the house was not equipped with one of the beautiful house altars found by Woolley, a place for cultic activities might have been here. Let's now come to one of the highlights of the house, to this beautiful, neatly paved lavatory. A hole in the middle was linked to a drainage shaft more than 8 meters deep still today. The excellent hygienic conditions certainly contributed to the health of the inhabitants of Ur in the Isin Lhasa period, because their anthropological remains revealed an exceptionally healthy population with little diseases thanks to hygiene and good health care. Along the wall of room 4 were found several lentil-shaped and a few rectangular school tablets. One of the tablets was found bent over an inverted bowl in such a way that it must have still been soft when it had been disposed there. This is a strong argument that school education took place in this house. The neighboring room 5 was used as a thresh area when the house was abandoned at the end of phase 1. Shirts, remains of meals, and no longer needed cuneiform documents and sealed labels were deposited here, as well as letters and sealed letter cases, school tablets, and literary texts. The letters had been sent by a certain Sinada to his wife Nutuptum. He used 2 different seals for sealing the letter cases. His first seal shows the sublime goddess standing opposite a male god. The inscription characterizes Sinada as the priest of the Ningal temple and as servant of Sin Eribam. This king of Lhasa reigned from 1842 to 40 only, which gives a fairly precise date. Even more precise is the date delivered by more letter cases, which had been sealed with the second seal of Sinada. This seal, showing the standard Old Babylonian motif of the victorious king opposite the sublime goddess, testifies that Sinada had been promoted to the principal of the Ningal temple, but now he is called servant of Tsili Adad. This most unlucky king of Lhasa ruled for 9 months only in 1835, before he was dismissed by Kudur Mabuk, who installed his son Warad Zine on the throne of Lhasa. The seal can therefore be dated to 1835 precisely. Nutuptum, Sinada's wife, is quite well attested on labels which she had sealed with her very fine seal, by a letter which Nutuptum's father had sent to her, and by 4 tablet labels and 18 sealed labels dealing with the deliveries of wet draff. I have to explain that draff is a byproduct of the brewing process, which has been in use as a livestock feed until today and was used in Mesopotamia especially for the fattening of sheep. According to the texts, the draff was received by Nutuptum from Mrs. Eburitum. This testifies for 2 economically active women, Eburitum being involved in large-scale brewing and Nutuptum being in charge of livestock fattening. There's even more evidence for Nutuptum. The kitchen was equipped with 2 large ovens and an accurate drainage system. But the room served not only for a well-organized food production, probably exceeding the private needs of a household, but the alcove below the staircase served also as a private retreat for the house lady. Nutuptum would retain here a bull's horn, a little bitumen-coated basket, 2 bowls, and a letter from her husband, where Sinada just wrote her, "Say to Nutuptum, thus Sinada, I'm well, do not worry at all." We would love to know why she kept this rather laconic letter. Was it perhaps the last note of her husband? She kept also a terracotta plaque next to this letter, which depicted the seated king feasting and drinking. We get the overall impression of Nutuptum as a literate person, loyal to her husband and the king, and actively involved in the provisioning of the Ningal temple. Taken all the evidence together, we conclude that Sinada and his wife Nutuptum were the inhabitants of the house in the first phase. Since some tablets concerning the deliveries of flour to Sinada and others the delivery of draff to Nutuptum, we do get the impression that the couple was involved in the fattening of livestock and in the preparation of bread. Probably both were responsible for the sacrificial offerings in the Ningal temple. When the house of phase 1 was abandoned and altered in phase 2, a part of the house archives was thrown away. Since the latest objects date to King Tsili Adad, we suggest that Sinada's family had to leave the house and possibly even the city due to the political takeover by Warad Zine, who might have exchanged especially officials in high-ranking positions. Just to remind you, the Ningal temple is not just around the corner, but it seems that the couple had moved here at a certain moment for good reasons and built here their spacious villa. The question is, when and why would they have moved here? There is one striking irregularity. There was no vaulted family tomb below the main room 6, nor below any other room. By contrast, there's a door which gives direct access from room 6 to a large open space with a vaulted tomb. This tomb was leaned against a broad mud brick wall, was 4 by 2 meters large, and consisted of 2 chambers. It must have been a corbel vaulted tomb, similar to one excavated by Woolley in EM. In the large southern chamber, the remains of 11 individuals were found. However, mainly the long bones and skulls were found, while smaller bones were missing. What is very strange and different from the tombs reported by Woolley is that not a single skeleton was found complete. In the small northern chamber, the human remains of at least 13 individuals were even more carefully arranged, but again, only the long bones and skulls were piled up like in a bone house, while the smaller bones were missing. What is also remarkable, some of the bones derived from children, even from a baby. Woolley claims that babies and children were never found buried inside the family tombs. However, since Zinada and Nutuptum inhabited the house only for a couple of years, it's impossible that 24 members of their family died within this short period. If we add all the evidence, it's likely that the long bones and skulls had been brought here from somewhere else when Zinada built here his house and the tomb. What could the open space around the tomb have been? Dominique Charpin pointed out to me a text published by Molina in 2019 mentioning an underground tomb which was situated in the garden of the deceased, who was the chief lamentation singer of Lagash in the Ur-3 period. Apparently there was ample space here at the periphery of the city that the house owner could even afford to have a large garden or courtyard outside the house. So when had the house been built? Not only the tomb leaned against a more broad mud brick wall, also many walls and the pavement of Zinada's house had been built immediately on top of leveled mud brick structures. These structures are part of the Ur-3 level, which consists of a row of narrow, doorless rooms, possibly storerooms or a granary, and a large courtyard. Many objects which were found on this courtyard, such as various weight stones, cylinder seals, or a set of carinated bowls inside a deep vessel, were associated with economic procedures such as weighing, measuring, and possibly distributing goods. This fits very well the situation near the city gate. Possibly goods were brought in here from outside the city, were registered, stored, and distributed in this area during the Ur-3 period. So when then was the house built? We saw that Zinada, principal of the Ningal temple, and his wife Nutuptum were the first inhabitants and lived in the house until 1835 BC. They had ample space for building their spacious villa with a regular ground plan, and there was even enough space to build the family tomb in the garden outside the house. Inside the tomb, the remains of 24 long-deceased family members show that they had been transferred here long after their decomposition. Clearly, the family had moved here from elsewhere, possibly from the crowded city center. Woolley, in Excavations at Ur 1954, argues that the AH quarter was in social decline during Ramzin's reign. Perhaps this was partly due to a demographic change. Whoever could afford it moved further to the periphery. Since Zinada built his house directly on leveled Ur-3 wall, it is clear that there existed no earlier Isin Lhasa occupation here. This fits perfectly with the new historical information published 10 years ago. The clay barrel mentions that King Sin Idinam of Lhasa rebuilt the city wall of Ur, expanded the Kitush, the living quarters of Ur, and settled the children of Ur in this more peaceful new living quarter where they could sleep well, probably because it was less noisy than in the city center. Zinada and Nutuptum apparently profited from Sin Idinam's building program and moved here into the lavish area of new development, where they had lots of space to build the second largest house so far known at Ur. Presumably, they had lived before in the crowded city center. Anyway, they brought the bones of the deceased family members with them and buried the old bones in the brand new family tomb. But before a member of Sinada's family could die and was to be buried in the tomb, Sinada's fate turned down and he and his family had to leave the city, or at least their property. We conclude from this evidence that the settled area of Ur shrank considerably after the Ur-3 destruction in 2003 and was mainly restricted to the city center. It was only 150 years later that Zine Idinam's restoration program created new living areas at the periphery. The new contour map on the right shows how the old Babylonian living quarters EM and AH in the ancient city center rose constantly to a height of 20 meters above sea level, while Sinada's house and the southern part of the South Mount were situated much lower at only 7 meters above sea level. In case that not only Sinada and Nutuptum, but many more elite families moved there, this may have caused a demographic change of city quarters. Geophysics shows that Ur was densely settled again in the Old Babylonian period, but it seems to have been a long process of 150 years until Ur in the mid-19th century fully recovered from the destruction, to be abandoned again only 100 years later. These results were achieved with the support of many people. Which I want to thank here. His Excellencies Abdelamir Hamdani and Qais Rashid, the representatives and workmen from Nasriye, Elizabeth Stone, Paul Szymanski and Brett Hafford, Dominique Charpin, Walter Sallerberg and Anne Löhnert, Kathy Twiss and Mike Charles, the archaeologists of LMU Munich, especially Albert Dietz, Martin Gruber and Elisa Rosberger, Andrea Göring, the team of geophysics, and last but not least, Bertolt Einwag, the Gerda Henkel Foundation and LMU Munich. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Otto. I think that was a wonderful example of the sort of microhistories we can reconstruct in Near Eastern archaeology through integration of archaeological, epigraphic, iconographic, and other forms of evidence. I think a wonderful keynote for our field report section.
Thank you.
So now, on our second theme of environmental archaeology, it's a great pleasure to introduce my University of Reading colleague, Professor Sandy Harrison, who will lecture on the subject of the climate-humans-climate nexus, modeling the impact of climate on agricultural production and agricultural expansion on global climate. The floor is yours, Professor Harrison. Thank you.
So I want to talk today about the climate-human-climate nexus, and particularly the way we can model the impact of climate on agricultural production and agricultural expansion on global climate. And I want to look at the tools that we have available to address these issues. I'm a paleoclimatologist interested in how changes in climate impact vegetation and fire on timescales ranging from interannual variability through to millennial trends. And I also want to look at how vegetation and fire, in turn, impact climate through changes in albedo and changes in emissions. But you can't—
Sandy, can I just interrupt to ask you to share your slides, please?
Sorry, I thought I was doing that. Hold on a second.
Thank you.
Okay. Is that sharing now, Roger?
Not yet. Yes, we're getting that.
Okay. Right. Let's try again then. Okay.
Excellent. That looks good.
Is that fine? Good.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. So you can't look at climate, vegetation, fire interactions in the Holocene without also considering the role of human activities. However, separating the influences of these different drivers of land use change is difficult because they're all interacting. So climate affects vegetation type, and on shorter timescales, vegetation type affects fire regimes. But climate also affects fire regimes by influencing the incidence of fire-promoting weather. Vegetation type, in turn, reflects back to climate by changing in albedo, and changes in fire regime also affect climate through particulate emissions and the release of trace gases. Climate affects people by creating the resource base which they can exploit, but people also obviously change the vegetation types, and they use fire to open up landscapes that they can then exploit. The influence of land use and fire on climate is dramatic, but the influence of people, as we've seen most dramatically in post-industrial times, also has a major influence on climate. In order to disentangle these very complex multivariate relationships, we need tools that enable us to look at each of them individually. So we need independent reconstructions of climate, vegetation, fire, and population. We need statistical techniques that allow us to disentangle the individual influences on any given phenomenon through time. And most importantly, we need models that incorporate physical processes that we understand and can be used to test explicit hypotheses about the causes of observed changes. We need models of climate or Earth system models. We need models of vegetation and fire, and we also need crop models to look at how people have used the landscape. So what I want to do now is to run quickly through some new approaches that have been developed that enable us to look at the interaction between climate, humans, and climate. And I'll start first with climate reconstructions. Climate reconstructions are generally made using pollen preserved in lakes or bog sediments. And the most common technique that we use is TWA-PLS, weighted averages partial least squares. This is a modern analog type approach which relates the abundance of particular plant taxa to the climate, modern day climate, and then applies that relationship down core in order to reconstruct climate through time. WAPLS has a known problem, which is that it tends to produce a bias in reconstructions towards the center of the climate range, which it's sampling. You can see this in the plots here on the left, the top row of plots, where I'm showing reconstructions of modern climate. The first column is winter temperature, the second column summer temperature, and the third an index of moisture availability. And the red line on these plots shows you the bias from a true representation in the WAPLS reconstructions. And you can see that whereas the red lines are close to the one-to-one line in the center of the climate range, there are very large biases at either end. We've developed a new technique called FX-TWAPLS, which tries to solve for this bias in two ways. First of all, it uses the climate tolerance of individual species to narrow the range over which they are being sampled. And then secondly, it uses the frequency, or it takes account of the frequency with which the climate is being sampled, adjusting for either over or under representation of the climate. And the idea of removing these biases is, first of all, to be able to reconstruct the extreme high or low climate situations, and thus to provide a better estimate of the true climate variability through time. The fact that FX-TWAPLS works is shown in the very bottom column here, and the bottom row of these columns on the left, where you can see that the red line is very much closer to the one-to-one line across all of the climate range. The fact that this then gives us a better estimate of the true climate variability is shown in the plots on the right, where the grey lines are the traditional WAPLS, and the red lines are our new technique, FXTWAPLS. And you can see that the red lines show considerably more variability in all of the climate variables, giving both higher and lower values. And so we believe that this is giving us a better estimate of the magnitude of climate changes through time. We can apply this technique to regional pollen samples, and here I'm showing an application to Iberia, where we have about 120 different individual records. And I'm again showing reconstructions here of winter temperature on the top, summer temperature in the middle, and a moisture index on the bottom. And these plots are against age, so we're going from about 11.5 at the bottom of the plot to modern day at the top. What you can see here is that the changes in winter temperatures go from cold conditions right across the Iberian Peninsula through gradual warming towards the present. These changes are consistent with the known insulation forcing that is driving temperature changes during the Holocene. On the other hand, the pattern of changes in summer temperature in the middle plot here is not regular. It differs from site to site, and it certainly does not follow the trend in insulation that we would expect it to. It is, however, much more closely related to the changes in moisture. And this is showing us that changes in moisture, however those are produced, are actually driving the changes in summer temperature through controlling evapotranspiration. One of the characteristics of the climate of Iberia today is a strong gradient from west to east in moisture, with wetter conditions in the west and drier conditions in the interior and the east. The reconstructions of the early Holocene show that there were very large changes towards increased wet conditions in the early Holocene in the east, which shows that the gradient, this west-east gradient, was much more muted in the early Holocene. The implication of this is that atmospheric circulation was changed in such a way as to bring stronger penetration of moisture into the Iberian Peninsula and into the Mediterranean in general. So by using this new technique, we can come up with some strong statements about the drivers of climate changes in this region and how they interact with one another. So now let's look at vegetation reconstructions. Again, the traditional approach to reconstructing vegetation is a modern analog approach where you characterize biomes or vegetation types by their current vegetation plant types. In most of these techniques, the emphasis is on plant functional types and the abundance of characteristic plant functional types within each biome. There are some problems with this approach. First of all, there's a certain amount of subjectivity in the allocation, deciding which plant functional types are present in which vegetation type. There's also the fact that this technique ignores the variability in the abundance of plant functional types or in individual species throughout a biome. And this can cause problem because it basically only wants to reconstruct the central tendency of the biome again. There are also known problems in that pollen from other vegetation types can be transported through long-distance transport, particularly into open vegetation. So steppe vegetation, for example, and tundra vegetation is often contaminated by the presence of forest pollen. And there's also the issue that it doesn't do well in terms of reconstructing non-climatic vegetation types, including agriculture. And finally, because this technique is heavily reliant on the actual abundance of individual pollen types, it is very sensitive to small changes in those abundances, and so can produce unstable reconstructions when taken back through time. We've developed a new technique to try and overcome these problems, which is a probabilistic approach, which accounts for the observed variability within vegetation types and the possibility that pollen may be present in assemblages that is non-local. We do this by characterizing the modern vegetation types by the pollen that is actually found there, rather than the pollen that would represent the vegetation that is growing there. And here I'm showing two different vegetation types, cool mixed forest on the left and Gramenite steppe on the right. What you see from this is that whereas each of these pollen vegetation types is characterized by the dominance of pollen types that you would expect to be there, so in the cool mixed forest or tree types shown in blue, and in the graminoids, open vegetation types or grasses shown in yellow, you can nevertheless see that in each of the vegetation types, the opposite type of pollen is present in some abundance. And you can also see from these graphs that there is quite a range of variability in the expression even of the dominant or characteristic pollen types. When we apply this probabilistic approach to looking at modern vegetation in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, we can produce a good representation of the vegetation types with an overall accuracy of about 80% at individual sites. That's shown by the plot on the top, which gives you the measure with which we can reconstruct observed biomes using this prediction technique. Moreover, we can also reconstruct the geographical patterns with some fidelity. So here I'm showing the changes in modern vegetation across the Eastern European Middle East region, where the light colors are open vegetation. You can see those dominant in the south and in the east, giving way to more evergreen vegetation shown in green towards the coast. And then in the northeast here, the more cool forests, cool mixed forests that are characteristic of the mountain regions. So this technique enables us to make good reconstructions of the modern vegetation, taking account of the probabilities that we see in the modern day samples. But it also allows us to make reconstructions down core. And here I'm showing just 6 examples from the same region, 6 individual sites, each representative of a biogeographic region. And the thing that you see from these plots is that we have relatively stable probabilities of different vegetation types through time. The darker colors at the bottom are forest vegetation, the lighter colors at the top are open landscapes. And what you see in all of these plots is the dominance of open landscapes in the early part of the Holocene, around to about 10,000, gradually being replaced by more forested vegetation as we go through the Holocene. The timing of the dominance of forested vegetation varies from region to region, and in some regions, so in this southern region down here, we see that there's a dominance of open vegetation almost throughout the Holocene, but nevertheless, we can get stable reconstructions of vegetations through time. So the traditional way of reconstructing fire is to use individual charcoal records and then to synthesize these to look at global or regional patterns in the trends in the amount of charcoal through time, using that composite of the amount of charcoal through time as a qualitative estimate of burning. And here I'm showing 2 plots, one for the northern extratropics, one for the southern extratropics, of the trend in the amount of charcoal through time from the last glacial maximum towards the present. You see that there are strong trends and different trends between the 2 areas, and you also see that these trends mirror the changes in temperature shown by the Greenland and Antarctic ice cores. The problem with these kinds of reconstructions is that they are qualitative. They tell us what the long-term trends may be, but they don't tell us whether this is a change in burnt area, a change in the amount of biomass burnt, or a change in the ferocity of the fires. And in order to really make a comparison of fire reconstructions with other kinds of evidence, we need to be quantitative. If you look at the controls of fire in the modern day landscape, using a generalized linear model, one of the things that you see is that the determinant of the amount of area burnt is strongly controlled by vegetation properties. So here it's gross primary production and the amount of non-tree cover. We can use this relationship to derive a new method to reconstruct burnt area quantitatively through time. We do this by deriving a relationship between the pollen and the charcoal at individual sites. And again, I'm showing a case example from Iberia. We can then calibrate the modern charcoal, which is qualitative, to produce a quantitative estimate of burnt area by looking at the modern records. And then we can apply this calibrated relationship to the pollen records from this region in order to come up with a composite history of fire through time. The bottom plot shows such a quantitative reconstruction of area burnt through time. And what you see here, this is the blue line is the composite average, and the grey lines show you the uncertainty around that average. And what you see here is that over the Iberian Peninsula, we have a reconstruction of the amount of area burnt that closely follows the broad-scale changes in climate. So we see an increase in fire during the Berling-Allerød, a decrease in the Younger Dryas, an increase towards the end of the Younger Dryas, and then relatively low amounts of area burnt during the early to mid-Holocene, when the region was probably wetter than present, a gradual increase about 5,000 years ago, culminating in the medieval warm period, and a decrease as we go into the Little Ice Age. So here we have a situation where we are indeed able to produce quantitative estimates of area burnt through time using a combination of charcoal and pollen records. So the final quantitative reconstruction that I want, of course, is population. And here I'm again showing changes in population built from radiocarbon dates on archaeological material through time. So here on the top plot, we have the summed probability distribution of population based on the archaeological dates. You see a kick up at the beginning of the regional start of early farming, and you also see other changes in population at key points through time. And I'll just point to the large change at 5,000 years ago that we were seeing. You can also use these radiocarbon dates to make estimates of the spatial pattern of people through time. And here I'm showing kernel density estimates of spatial patterns in population at 6,000 years and 4,000 years BP, where the darker colours show inferred higher population and the lighter colours show low population numbers. Now, once we have these quantitative reconstructions of the individual variables, we can start to explore the relationship between these variables through time. So I'm now looking at the relationship between population changes and fire regimes over the Holocene in Iberia. And if you look at these relationships between charcoal abundance and population abundance, you can see that overall through the Holocene, there is a fairly strong relationship between the amount of fire on the landscape and the amount of people on the landscape. However, we can take this and we can break it down into different time periods. And what we see here in the top plot is this whole period divided into the pre-agricultural period shown in blue and the post-agricultural period shown in pink. You see that the relationship that we saw overall between people and fire is very strongly driven by the early part of the record, whereas the number of people on the landscape increases, so the amount of fire increases. And then you see that once agriculture has started in the region, we do not have a strong relationship between the number of people and the amount of fire. But of course, we can break that down still further, and that's what I'm doing in the bottom plot here, where I've broken down that post-agricultural period into 3 2,000-year periods. And you see that the lack of relationship between people and fire is really dominated by the earlier part of the record here, between 7,000 and 9,000 BP. After 7,000, we have a strong increase in fire, and that strong increase in fire is tied to a strong increase in people. And then after about 5,000, between 5,000 and 3,000 BP, we see the opposite relationship. As the number of people increase, so the amount of fire on the landscape goes down. Now, these relationships are not causal. They're only correlative at this stage. But if we have quantitative reconstructions of all of the different variables that are interacting, we can use generalized linear modeling to try and tease apart the controls, for example, in this case on fire, the influence on fire of both climate, vegetation changes and people changes through time. And this is, I hope, the next step in these analyses. Okay, so now we come to modelling. I want to talk first of all a little bit about the advantages of modelling. The advantages of modelling are that we can use models incorporate explicit processes, physical processes that we know and understand, or they can exploit relationships, empirical relationships that are well-founded from data analysis. And once you have built a model that includes these kinds of processes, you can then use the model to test explicit hypotheses about the controls on a particular phenomenon. So let me start first of all with crop modelling. Here's a simple crop model. In this case, it's actually a crop model for wheat, which links processes that control gross primary production as a function of climate variables, CO2, leaf area index, and elevation. And these are all physically driven processes that control gross primary production. And then we link gross primary production to above and below ground biomass allocation using empirical relationships founded on data analysis. And then we link above ground biomass, AB, to the yield of wheat seeds, again based on an empirical relationship from data analysis. This model, PC model, produces an accurate prediction of the potential wheat yield in the modern day, that's shown on the top panel here, compared to observations of maximum wheat yields in these same regions. What you can see from these graphs, comparing these graphs, is that not only does the model predict the geographic patterning of higher and lower wheat yields, potential wheat yields, but it also predicts the magnitude of wheat yields correctly. This gives us confidence in being able to use this to investigate what leads to changes in wheat yield through time. So the model allows us to calculate the yield gap, which is the difference between the potential and actual yield at any one time. And this yield gap tells us about the differences between management, whether the management of the wheat crop is maximizing the potential yield or not. More importantly, once we have this model, we can diagnose whether changes in yield or changes in the yield gap are due to the influence of climate or due to the influence of CO2 fertilization or due to changes in management. And we can do this by running several simulations. So the plots on the right here show two simulations. In the top one, we've changed climate and CO2 between 2000 and 2015 and looked at the potential yield that is generated by these external drivers. And then in the second experiment, in the central plots here, we've kept climate static at 2000 and allowed only CO2 change. So this enables us to separate out the influence of climate and CO2 on yield. And in the bottom plot, we then look at the different changes in climate at a regional basis to see whether it's changes in precipitation or changes in temperature that are driving the changes in yield. Comparing these experiments leads to some very interesting conclusions. So we see, for example, that in Europe, where we have an increase in potential yield over this period, that increase is largely driven by CO2 fertilization. There's no change in climate that drives this and no change in management that is driving this. If we look, however, at somewhere like Turkey, we see that climate is playing a very big role here because the CO2 changes alone would lead to an increase in yield, and yet what's being shown, the combined effect, is a decrease in yield over much of the region. So this is saying that there's a deleterious effect of climate changes in this 15-year period, which is partially and only partially offset by the changes in CO2. If we look at regions where there has been decreased yield, and here I'm looking at Australia, for example, you can diagnose that the change in yield is not caused by a change in precipitation, but has been caused by increasing temperatures over this 15-year period. So here we have the possibility to look at, admittedly in the modern time, but this could be applied in the past as well, we have the possibility of looking at how crop changes may have occurred in the record, and whether these are due to climate changes, human changes, as in management changes, or changes in CO2 level, fertilization. So finally, I want to come to the impact of people on climate. On the left-hand plot here, I'm showing you the impact of human post-industrial land use changes on the climate. What you see is that the post-industrial land use changes have led to a slight cooling, biophysical cooling of about 0.03 degrees over the post-industrial period. And this is because of the albedo changes that occur when you convert forest land to open vegetation. However, that biophysical cooling has been offset by a biogeochemical warming, that's shown in the red lines here, red and yellow lines here, and that's essentially due to the change in carbon storage caused by the change in land use. So overall, the total historical land use change since the post-industrial period has led to an overall warming of the climate. You can also see the impact of land use changes in the Holocene. These are, on the right here, a series of experiments made with the climate model with imposed land use changes from the KK10 data set. And what you see is that by about 7,000 years BP, that's the first graph on the left here, we already see some discernible changes, some cooling occurring in the climate in the Northern Hemisphere. And certainly by about 5,000 BP, that's the second plot on the left, you can see that there is a very large change of up to 2 degrees C over the areas where there was high, in these simulations, high land use intensity over Europe and northern China, for example. And that by about 2,000 years BP, the impact of land use changes is felt over most of the world. Now, the problem with these experiments is that they are the results of making large changes in land use, large changes in land use. And so this raises the issue of whether they are correct, whether the land use changes that were imposed are accurate. We have two major sources of land use changes at the moment, the HIDE database and KK10. The HIDE database here shown on the left-hand side and KK10 on the right-hand side for two periods in time, 6,000 BP and 450 BP. And you can see that there are very large differences between these two sets of predictions. And you can imagine that if you feed in KK10, you're going to get a large change in climate due to land use. If you fed in HIDE, you'd get a much smaller change in land use. So this makes it very important to know which of these, if any of them, are actually accurate. And this brings me to the Land Cover 6K project. Land Cover 6K is a project sponsored by Pages, which is trying to make accurate reconstructions of land use through the Holocene based on two sources of data, archaeological data and pollen data. And we're combining these sources of archaeological and pollen data in order to make land use maps to indicate the start of agriculture, to look at the types of agriculture so we can distinguish between grazing and cropland, and to look at population changes which underpin the land use changes in both of the current data sets. We've made a start on doing this by combining archaeological evidence from Europe and Eurasia and pollen evidence from that region also in order to make an estimate of land use changes, and we've imposed that within the HIDE database. The good news for us at the moment is that in this particular region, the changes it doesn't make much change to the land use map. So here's HIDE 3.2 at the bottom on the left here, the old version of the database, and HIDE 3.3, the new version of the database with these new inputs. And you can see that there isn't very much difference in where we think there was agriculture this happens to be 6,000 years ago, although perhaps it's a little less constrained in the new database. But it's not true of other regions. Other regions, there are much larger differences when you start building in the observations. So I want to finish with three take-home messages here. First of all, I want to emphasize that disentangling the climate-human climate nexus is possible given independent and robust reconstructions of each of the elements that we need to examine and the increasingly powerful statistical approaches that we have. I also want to emphasize that modeling tools make it possible to look at how climate and the resource base could have affected humans in the past, and it also makes it possible to look at how human land use change could have affected climate. And I want to make a plea here during this conference because I believe that archaeology has a key role to play in making reliable reconstructions of human impacts on environment and climate in the past, and that we really need to work together as a paleoclimatology and archaeological communities in order to ensure that these reconstructions are made and implemented and we can understand what impact humans have had on the climate in the past. And finally, I'd like to thank my team at the University of Reading and my team at the University of Tsinghua and my long-term colleagues for allowing me to share with you some of these results today. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Harrison, for that, bringing us up to speed really with the latest developments in analysis and modeling of a range of data, clearly enabling us to have greater resolution and confidence in the models we propose for the past as well as the future, of course. And I'm sure your plea for engagement with archaeological evidence is very warmly received by this audience. Thank you very much.
And I hope I will have a chance, Roger, to talk to people during the rest of this conference and see if we can make those links stronger. Thank you.
Excellent. Yes, you'll be able to do that through the chat function in Ibrida, of course. So thank you, Sandy. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to move to our keynote lecture for the third theme of hammering the material world. And I'm delighted now to introduce Dr. Francesca Balossi-Restelli, whose lecture will cover the topic of From Pottery Manufacture and Use to Social Relations at the Beginning of Full-Time Craftsmanship, the case of Arslan Tepe, 3900-3400 BCE, Eastern Turkey. Thank you very much, Dr. Restelli.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am glad that we have been able to meet. I have very much missed the ICAANE last year. I am not sure if I'm online, but I shall continue. In opening, so I want, to unite in thanking Nicolò Marchetti and the organizers for having made this possible. In opening the session on material culture, I hope that the structure that I have given to my presentation shall well interpret the idea that the organizers have on such a topic. Material culture is a bastion of archaeological research. Objects have always been central to its endeavors through the process of classification. As products of a particular socio-cultural milieu, assemblages of similar objects ordered in coherent typologies have long been interpreted as the manifestation of shared identities, the archaeological culture. Although passionately debated, the establishment of object typologies and the chronologies associated with the various styles remain fundamental to define human groups that have occupied a specific area in a specific period of time. Archaeological cultures remain the building blocks of our reconstructions, being valuable heuristic tools through which we build a framework for understanding past communities. Material culture is tangible and observable. And even though there is broad consensus today that artifacts also convey a variety of intangible messages, their materiality makes of the relationship between typology and technology not simply one of priority, but one of complementariness. Material, shape, and decoration are inseparable attributes of an artifact. Thus, The study of typology needs to be accompanied by that of technology. The tradition of technological studies is deeply rooted in processual archaeology and in the French school of lithic studies that brought to expand the chaîne opératoire approach to all categories of material culture and is a now widely common scholarly approach. Technological studies today are not what they were in the past. The broad consensus over the entanglement between technology and socio-cultural processes has moved the attention from technology itself to technological behavior. The aim is thus not simply to understand how artifacts were made, but also if and how economic, social, and cultural factors influence the organization of craft activities and production, and the adoption of new techniques and inventions. The awareness of the social and cultural dimensions of technological practices has strongly reinforced the relation between archaeologists and archaeometrists, and the interdisciplinary work that this has triggered has partly overcome the difficulties of interpretation. Over the past decades, material culture has come to take the burden of much broader forms of social analysis. Archaeologists have realized that objects do not just provide a stage setting to human action, they are integral to it. Through material culture, we produce, exchange, consume, perform. This focus has brought the attention to the way human and object histories are tied to each other, how social interaction involving people and objects create meaning. The social life of things has stimulated numerous new approaches to the study of material culture in archaeology. Scholars engaged in this debate stress that society is materially constructed, as social interaction involves both people and objects, and this interaction creates meaning. That is, people give meaning to objects, and objects contribute to give meaning to actions. These theoretical approaches have stimulated the flourishing of abundant biographies of objects that often moved the scale of analysis from a broad one to a more detailed investigation of specific, at times even single objects. Whilst it is impossible here to summarize all the theoretical and practical approaches to the study of artifacts in archaeology, it is my understanding that none of these fully deny the rest. Recent research has very much revolutionized our interpretation of artifacts' social meaning and has increased our points of view, but each of these adds on to the others, not necessarily refuting them. The sequence with which we approach the study of an assemblage of artifacts is, in my view, steady and untouched by all theoretical advancements. I still believe that all investigations should start with a classification based on macroscopic, technological, and morphostylistic characters, to which must be combined a thorough microscopic research. These can be carried out on massive numbers of materials, providing a solid statistical basis for a general understanding of the investigated assemblages. Contextual analysis constitutes the next step for a complete reconstruction of the object's life cycle and practical use. And this is how it would look like if I get back to our archaeological cases. The multiple points of view elaborated for the identification and interpretation of the many attributes and meanings of artifacts still need today to set their roots in a secure typo-technological understanding of any material assemblage. The example with which I hope to convince you about this today draws on my personal work on the ceramic assemblage of late Chalcolithic 3-4 period at the site of Arslan Tepe in eastern Anatolia. Ceramics are a main core of archaeological research, certainly because of their ubiquity and durability, but consider this as an example valid for all categories of artifacts. Arslan Tepe, a site with a very long occupation, is in the upper Euphrates Valley, close to the modern Turkish city of Malatya. I shall refer to one period of life of the site, dated from 3900 to 3400 BCE and corresponding to the site period 7. In this long period, characterized by at least 8 distinct architectural phases and several rebuildings, Arslan Tepe underwent significant changes, similarly to what was also happening in the rest of Mesopotamia in terms of social and economic growth in complexity. It is in these centuries that we assist to the appearance of social differentiation through the segregation of spaces within the site, with domestic quarters for what we might call common houses distant from the larger, more imposing and more regularly planned elite residences. The latest phase of occupation of Arslan Tepe 7 furthermore sees two tripartite monumental buildings, the similarities of which with contemporary structures in Mesopotamia as well as in situ hundreds of bowls suggests its ceremonial use for ritualized consumption events that the early 4th millennium pre-state elites of Greater Mesopotamia used to reinforce their power. The pottery assemblage of this long period is a very conservative production with only few apparent changes within the 500 years. Pottery is mostly chaff-tempered, often chaffed face, since the vegetal temper is abundant and visible on the surface of the vessels. The most typical category is a red slipped and burnished class of jars, beakers, and bowls. The non-red slipped version is mostly used for larger jars and pitoi, and in a coarser version for bowls. 19% of the pottery is instead tempered with different types of mineral and a small amount of chaff. Finally, a very small percentage of the pottery is fine and only mineral tempered. Macroscopically, 8 pottery categories are distinguished on the basis of temper, surface treatment, and color. I shall not show you the single types identified through morphological and stylistic similarities, but use this broad classification to discuss artifact similarities and their meaning. Our discipline is predicated on the assumption that societies are associated with particular material forms, and that the identification of these yields information on the groups that created them. People, society, culture are units defined by varying identities. Material culture, in this sense, becomes one of the many identity markers. The red slipped and burnished ceramic category that characterizes Arslan Tepe period 7 is abundant in the region southwest of the Malatya plain and might suggest some form of contact with that area. Another shared category of material culture between these two regions are bone pins, identical in shape. Does this mean that this wide region formed one unit? And what kind of unit was it? Wide-scale regional identities can intersect with more local, individual, or gendered identities played through the production and use of local artifact types. Stylistic similarities are not accidental. Rather, they can reflect decisions regarding material expression that relate to common experience, that in turn reflect social interaction, movements of people, and notions of conformity, and are all elements that determine the complex distribution of material culture. When we look at the different categories of the Arslan Tepe 7 pottery, this perception becomes palpable. We notice, for example, that the red-black burnished ware appears to be shared with Central Anatolia, whilst the chaff-tempered coarse bowls are found throughout Upper Mesopotamia, region with which Arslan Tepe 7 also shares other material expressions as the eye idols and the important presence of the tripartite monumental buildings. The sharing of the tripartite monumental buildings and bowls that is renowned or used mostly in the ceremonial context indicates more structural relations of the Arslan Tepe community with the Mesopotamian world, whilst the red-black burnished ware is probably the result of physical contacts with the Central Anatolian people due to pastoral activities or movements for other reasons that still need to be investigated. If ceramics talk to us about interactions between communities, they are most illuminating about relations within communities. The style of ceramics in relation to practices performed with them is crucial in the active performance and negotiation of roles and identities in everyday life. Observations on the mode of manufacture and use of the Arslan Tepe pottery give us an important insight into such practices. The pottery may be easily distinguished in two diverse manufacturing groups. One that has been called of wheel-finished pottery, composed of more regular and well-finished shapes, and one that has been called handmade because of the irregular profiles and varying thickness of the vessel body. The names given to these categories have been inspired by the traces on the interior of the vessels that suggest some form of turning device on what we called the wheel finished, whilst the other category often has still visible coils. The wheel-finished vessels have more regular profiles and elaborated rims. Shapes in these two categories repeat themselves, with bowls, beakers, globular jars occurring in both classes. There is another important distinction between the two: the presence of potter's marks on the wheel-finished category. The phenomenon of the potter's marks is shared over a wide area and is understood as indicating the presence of potter's workshops. All these data suggest the coexistence of two production systems of pottery production at Aslan-Tepe: workshops with specialized artisans and domestic manufacture. Concerning the workshops, who were these artisans and how were they organized? The distribution of the 39 identified types of marks suggest that in the latest phase, at least 32 workshops or potters might have been active at Aslan-Tepe. The distribution of the marks on the different shapes, furthermore, shows that workshops or potters were not specialized in the production of a specific shape, but rather of all wheel-finished kind of vessels. But how far justified is our definition of specialized for these workshops, and what exactly does this mean? Interdisciplinary dialogue and collaboration with archaeometry have provided interesting interpretations to these questions. Pamela Fragnoli has carried out in-depth archaeometric analyses, and I shall cite some of her results here. According to her petrographic classification, the assemblage can be divided in 10 different fabrics, which she then unites by affinity into two major paste groups. One characterized by organic tempered calcareous pastes with medium basic acid volcanic rocks of different granulometry. And very interestingly, in the early phases of period 7, this appears to be used for all open shapes. And another of organic tempered calcareous pastes with coarse intrusive basic rocks with different granulometry. The latter group is used preferentially for the closed shapes. Apparently thus, wheel-finished and handmade categories in early period 7 are made with analogous pastes, and what is instead discriminating in the choice of the paste is the shape and or size of the vessels, in that open shapes are smaller. Fragnoli has also identified the area of possible primary source procurement of most of the pottery classes just northeast of the site. It would thus appear that all potters used similar recipes and places to collect and process the clay. Potters, who certainly belonged to the same community, shared a know-how that possibly set its roots in repeated and learned daily practices and a fluidity of relations within the working community. The formal distinction, though, between workshops and domestic production indicated by the potter's marks has certainly to do with the birth and development of a working class, a phenomenon that is attested at other contemporary sites too, and had possibly started by the end of the previous Ubaid period. Notwithstanding the still strong integration of these specialized workers with the domestic realm, indicated at Aslan-Tepe by the shared ceramic pastes, the more regular shapes of the vessels with potter's marks suggest the acquisition of greater skills by the workshop artisans. A technotypological observation of the Aslan-Tepe bowls suggests to us that there were other factors too affecting modes of ceramic production and the development of different forms of labor. The period 7 has 4 macroscopically distinct groups of shaft-faced bowls: the simple round-based ones, those with a roughly flint-scraped base, the flat base, and finally the wheel-turned, recognizable by the presence of the string cut on the bottom as well as by concentric signs on the interior. The stratigraphic distribution of these indicates a rather clear evolution in the order I have listed them to the final introduction of the wheel. The move from one way of manufacturing to the next broadly goes in the direction of faster forming techniques at each stage, and the introduction of the wheel is certainly a major technological innovation. Whilst the use of the wheel needs specific skills and working instruments, well in keeping with the presence of specialized artisans, what is a bit puzzling is the continued and rather high presence of non-wheel-made bowls throughout our sequence. Fragnoli has carried out microscopic observations aimed at identifying the introduction of rotating devices of different intensities and to understand which were truly wheel-thrown bowls. She identified 12 modes of manufacture, groupable in 4 categories, characterized by increasing rotational kinetic energy. Even though of much greater detail than the macroscopic observations, interpretation goes in the same direction, with less rotation in the earlier round-based bowls and faster rotation as we move on in time through the flint scrape, then flat-based, and finally string-cut bowls. Fragnoli, too, notices a very high manufacturing variability in the latest levels, apparently in contrast with the idea of increasing specialization of artisans. Drawing on work of Roux, Longacre, Sinopoli, and others, we have further tackled this issue by analyzing shape standardization, the reduction of artifacts' shape variability, as this too is generally perceived as an indicator of craft specialization as a result of routinized gestures and skills. The coefficient of variation of bowls has been calculated to evaluate the degree of standardization within the whole bowl population. According to ethnographic work by Longacre, a coefficient of variation of 10% or under is consistent with expectations for specialized mass production of standardized utilitarian goods. Amongst our bowls, the only ones that would fall into this category are the wheel-turned ones. But it is also evident that the flat-based bowls are much more standardized than the round-based and flint-scraped ones. Whilst the combination of the macroscopic and microscopic observations is consistent in showing a gradually homogeneous product as we move to the wheel-turned bowls, neither explain why the less specialized bowls don't disappear. This is a perfect example in which it is the context that allows to explain the apparently inconsistent data. The latest phase of occupation at Aslan-Tepe is that of the monumental ceremonial buildings and related public ritualized meals to which we know that participated hundreds of people. Probably the existing potters' workshops were not able to satisfy the sudden increase in demand of bowls, and the meal organizers had to rely on non-specialized potters too. The demonstration of this comes from the calculation of the coefficient of variation of the bowls of this latest period, which reflects exactly that of the rest of period 7. Some specialized artisans do exist at Aslan-Tepe in the later phases of period 7, but they are unable to fulfill all requests. The fluid relations between people and working classes that is testified by the common paste recipes still in use allowed for the potters belonging to the two existing production systems, the wheel-finished and the handmade domestic one, to be integrated in a common collaborative activity for the supply of pottery to be used in the ceremonial consumption events. Extra, non-specialized workers were hired at need. Something similar was pointed out already by Hans Nissen for southern Mesopotamia, where the non-specialized nature of beveled rim bowl manufacture too suggested that numbers required were just too high to be produced by the more skilled potters, even though these existed. Besides the existence of the specialized potters, what else may we say about their economic position in the Aslan-Tepe society? Did these artisans produce only for the elites? Was this specialized craft activity totally controlled by them? Distribution of in situ materials, those left on the floor of houses at the moment of their abandonment or destruction, provides interesting data on this. Cooking pots in elite residences are mostly of the specialized wheel-finished type, whilst those from the common households are mostly of handmade, non-specialized category. Likewise, large pitoi and wide-mouth storage jars, only made in the wheel-finished category, are found solely in elite residences. It would thus appear that elites had some form of preferential access, even though not exclusive, to the pottery from the specialized workshops. Vessels for consumption, though, present a more fluid distribution. Even though elite residences do have a bit more specialized products than the common dwellings, these are found in the commoners' houses as well. Elites were probably the main buyers of specialized workshops, but common people also had access to at least part of these ceramics. The combination of a detailed and statistically significant technotypological analysis of pottery, chronological distribution, and specific evidence from the context of retrieval has allowed us to discuss the organization of craft production, to follow the development of specialized craft activities, and evaluate social accessibility to specialized craft work in this period. I have only indirectly referred to the way in which pottery was used and to what this too could tell us about relations within the Arslan-Tepe community. The differential distribution of in situ types and pottery categories shows varying and peculiar food preparation and consumption behaviors that suggest still strong shared practices between elite and non-elite families. The size variability in cooking pots indicates similar quantities of food prepared in both households, but more interestingly, private meals were entailing the existence of shared different assortments of foodways in private contexts. At the opposite end, the monotonous repetition of identical bowls in public meals leaves little space for imagination. But is this entirely true? Temple C was abandoned, still standing. The building did not burn down and remained as a ruin for a long time, as bat skeletons on its floor indicate. Nobody went into the effort of removing hundreds of bowls from the building. But are we sure that other objects that might have been in use suffered the same fate? Is it not rather probable that anything more useful or meaningful than bowls would have been removed? We could certainly find interesting data for such an inquiry, probably inspiring for object biographies, if we looked for missing artifacts. Restricted neck jars could be a case, as a dozen ring fragments were scattered on the floor, and the striking resemblance of the best preserved piece with the painting in the corner of the central room of the temple suggests a strong symbolic meaning of these vessels, their context, and possibly related drinking practices. But this will be the topic of another talk. To conclude, all these approaches and analyses have been possible because the late Chalcolithic III pottery of Arslan-Tepe has been studied by a whole team of researchers. 3 dissertations and a book have been written by 5 different archaeologists who have all looked over and over this material. 2 archaeometrists have carried out analyses, and other specialists have run use, tracewear, residue analysis, which I have not mentioned for reasons of time. I am aware of the fact that only with such a team, all the single approaches to material culture investigation may be placed together to construct the whole puzzle. But my hope and desire here today is to have suggested how each of these pieces are equally important and informative. Hammering the material world is a fitting image of what we do. We metaphorically hammer and revitalize the objects, and we hammer down the interpretation by long and intersecting arguments. With this, I wish you all to enjoy discussions in the coming days, to draw ideas from each other's research, to recharge from this prolonged period of individual overwork, one of the major side effects of the COVID pandemic for most of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Restelli. That was, I think, a really wonderful example of how long-term engagement at an archaeological site, as at Arslan-Tepe over decades, really enables extremely rich contextual analysis of material culture, as you so clearly and richly demonstrated through that lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For our final Congress theme keynote on the theme of endangered cultural heritage, it's now my privilege to introduce Mr. Nour A from the University of Amsterdam, who will lecture on the topic of competing heritage, curating the future heritage of post-conflict Syria. Over to you, Nour. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for the ICAANE organizing committee for this kind effort to organize such event during unprecedented circumstances. I'm deeply honored to be a member of the panelists for the keynote speech, considering my young age and my young participation in academia. So my talk today will be examining the heritage and conflict-related issues that need to be considered in post-conflict contexts, with a special focus on the case of Syria. The Syrian armed conflict has resulted in unprecedented damages to cultural heritage sites, monuments, and facilities. This has provoked scholars, institutes, and international and national non-governmental organizations to debate about the impact of damaging Syria's irreplaceable patrimony and the ways to safeguard its past from the ongoing destructive actions. This paper investigates, or this talk today will investigate, the uses of heritage in Syria before and during the ongoing conflict, and how Syria's heritage and collective memories were politicized for the benefit of the ruling regime. Today's Western academic writings and media reports present charismatic archaeology, such as Palmyra, as the point at which Europe ends, ignoring that this heritage not only belongs to Europe, but is originally Syrian and represents the identity and the memories of the local population. Lately, a new tendency in the West started to justify the European interest in reconstructing what Daesh or ISIS destroyed by claiming that Syrian heritage is part of a European heritage. The West sees the heritage of the nearest as being part of Europe's story and the origins of the Western civilization. This idea has been reinforced by over a century of archaeological exploration by Western archaeologists, in addition to statements of the Syrian government officials, such as Syria's former Director of Antiquities, Professor Mamoun Abdel Karim, who said during the ceremony of erecting the replica of Ark of Triumph in London, here I quote, "Palmyra's heritage is not just for the Syrian people." Scholars argue that conflicts play a significant role in changing the urban, social, and power structures, and therefore meanings and values are constantly transforming. Many have seen those transformations as negative ones, since they were in some way or another either reinforced by post-colonial regimes that have been ruling and still in many cases are the MENA region, or serve the aims of new colonialist and imperialist agendas produced by or from the West. Perhaps it's worth noting that there are several factors that have affected cultural heritage in the Middle East. Nationalism and pan-Arabism movements have emerged in the Middle East in the post-colonial period and have helped to establish parties and regimes that ruled the region and repurposed nearly every single aspect of the culture. The Syrian Antiquities Law was formulated and came into force once the Ba'ath Party seized power in Syria after the coup d'etat in March 1963. Now more than 50 years old, the Syrian Antiquities Law does not include all types of heritage that would today be considered as such by international conventions, such as natural heritage. Cultural heritage is briefly indicated in the 1973 Syrian constitution under Hafez al-Assad rule. The 1973 of Syria's constitution was mainly based on the socialist values that constantly attempted to devote all aspects of culture for the purpose of unifying the Arab world. During the ongoing conflict in Syria at the beginning of 2012, Bashar al-Assad, president of Syria, proposed a new draft of Syria's constitution, which was later approved in a public referendum in February 2012. The referendum on Syria's new constitution, has been largely criticized by the international community due to the Syrian regime's continuous military operations all over Syria. The 2012 version of Syria's constitution limits the definition of heritage as a tool to promote national unity and maintains the emphasis on nationalism and pan-Arabism as the vehicles that could achieve Arab unity. Heritage can be used to reconstruct and negotiate a wide range of values and cultural and social meanings today. Smith argues that we should think of heritage as a cultural process that can be negotiated through the lenses of identity, memory, place, and performance. Therefore, the intangible components that are embodied within heritage play a major role in keeping tangible heritage alive and remembered through everyday social practices. For instance, the valuation and appreciation of mosques by Muslims, regardless of whether these mosques have an Umayyad, Abbasid, or Ottoman architectural style, comes in part from the daily prayers that the Muslims perform within them. The post-colonial heritage practices have privileged some representations of the Syrian past over others to pursue agendas of governmental brand. Once Hafez al-Assad reached power in Syria in 1970, he worked hard with his Ba'athist regime to consolidate his rule, legitimize it, and promote his pan-Arab and nationalist ideologies in all different ways. For instance, the Roman Emperor Marcus Julius Philippus was portrayed on the Syrian banknotes as the Arab hero who ascended the throne of Rome and was promoted as Philip the Arab. Simultaneously, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, who came 30 years later and fought Roman imperialism, was also portrayed on the Syrian banknotes as the Arab hero. Portraying two opposing historic figures, is like portraying Tywin Lannister and Queen Daenerys Targaryen on the banknotes of the same country. This shows how the Ba'athist politicization of culture and history has evidently no limits. Heritage is a powerful tool that can play a key role in the politics of the contemporary world, as it is connected to power, politics, identity, belonging, economy, and most importantly, to the active and passive acts of remembering and forgetting. During the Ba'ath rule in Syria since 1963 to the present day, heritage and memory have been utilized as political tools. For instance, the Arab Golden Age of Umayyads has been actively remembered in secular context in Syria, while the subsequent Abbasid period has been remembered negatively by the Ba'athists of Syria. The main reason behind such politicization of the past is that Syria's Ba'ath sees the secular commemoration of the memory and heritage of Umayyads, who took Damascus as a capital during the 7th century, as the perfect example to combat Western colonialism and unify the Arab world under one flag. Threats of destruction of Syria's cultural heritage emerged at the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring in the MENA region, which started in Tunisia and continues to this day with a second wave in Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon. The destruction of archaeological sites in Syria differs from one side to another, as does the level of damage, which provoked the international community to inscribe Syria's 6 World Heritage Sites on the endangered list in 2013. There are undoubtedly blocs and political alliances within the World Heritage Committee, which are often built on political, economic, religious, or former colonial relations. This issue became apparent during the 2013 World Heritage Committee session, when it was proposed that the 6 Syrian sites to be added to the list of the World Heritage in danger. Russia, a historical loyal ally of the Syrian regime, strongly resisted this proposal in an attempt to prove that Assad regime adheres to the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict of 1954, as Syria signed and ratified this convention in 1958. However, Russian diplomacy failed to prevent the inscription of Syria's World Heritage Sites onto the list of sites in danger. This example, and many others, prove how heritage and archaeologies can be politicized and become a tool or a weapon that to be deployed at any moment, whenever the relevant actors aim to gain more profit at any level, diplomatic, national, or even regional. Academic and media reports and articles indicate that Syria's heritage has been endangered as a result of being damaged by several direct and indirect risks. Those statements, reports, and articles reiterate the extent to which the cultural heritage sites in Syria are endangered, and they describe the destruction of Syria's heritage as an irreplaceable resource, finite resource, and a threat to the Syrian history. Many heritage conventions and legislations state that endangered heritage sites should be preserved for the benefit of future generations. On the other hand, Trinidad Rico argues that heritage at risk is not in fact at risk at all. She adds that the value of heritage or the value of risk is formative for heritage, and in the assessment of heritage value, risk value tends not to be addressed. This tendency has created a one-way understanding of heritage at risk, which is mainly aimed at preventing heritage from loss and decay and stopping the nature of our ecosystem. Cornelius Holtrow from Linnaeus University suggests that heritage at risk has the ability to evoke the future and consequently colonize it, which is based on the idea that the future is a form of unchanging present. What has been destroyed is to be rebuilt. Furthermore, the increasing concerns about the preservation of heritage at risk has served as a justification to expand the horizon of heritage expertise in order to bring about new techniques, tools, and methods to rebuild what has been endangered or destroyed, such as the construction of Palmyra's arch replica. Archaeologically, Palmyra, for instance, has gained several new strata, and new items are certainly associated with the ongoing life cycle of this archaeological site. In fact, cultural tourism might witness an increasing interest in how the Arab Spring affected the cultural life of the region. Our living memory attests to the fact that the archaeological site of Palmyra is not completely preserved, and its monument did not withstand previous events of destructive transformations. For instance, Mulder describes how Palmyra during the French Mandate over Syria between 1920s until 1946, how Palmyra experienced several incidents of intentional selective destruction of heritage. By 1932, Palmyra's 330-year-old church and the 800 to 1,000-year-old mosque of Tadmor were demolished by the French, in order to remove from the Temple of Baal any post-Roman remains. The French colonial attempt to clear Palmyra from any Christian or Islamic remains was an act of image breaking, which can easily be compared to what Daesh has done during their double occupation of Palmyra. The site, however, has not been completely demolished or erased. It has evolved, and it continues to materially record the histories and memories of Syrians through the various historical conflicts that Palmyra has experienced. Conflict can provide new transformations and interpretations of the meanings of heritage, and at the same time, conflict can become a main cause for change in urban, social, and power structures. The war in Syria will end at some point, and when it does, establishing a reconstruction process should begin with investigating and acknowledging both the semantics of the destruction and the participant in obliterating Syria's patrimony. Post-war reconstruction of cultural heritage has the potential to prolong violence on a social level, as the reconstruction can be as destructive as the destruction itself. Scholars describe heritage as, here I quote, the contemporary usage of a past, consciously shaped from the history, its survivals and memories in response to current needs for it." End of quote. In October 1956, the UK, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to remove the pan-Arab Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had nationalized the Suez Canal. The Western attack was termed back then as the Triple Aggression by Egypt and the other pan-Arab regimes in the MENA region. More than 60 years later, the memory of the Triple Aggression was actively invoked and revived in press releases issued by the Ba'athist regime in Syria, when the US, UK, and France launched strikes in April 2018 in response to the use of chemical weapons in the Damascus suburb of Douma during the ongoing war in Syria. This evocation of memory and the attempt to further engrave the Triple Aggression in the memory of local population, in the memory of the Syrians, were made to promote the viewpoints of the Assad regime, that the Western powers are conspiring to destabilize Syria. The post-war reconstruction of Syria is under a heavy pressure of becoming a political process that serves the people in power, which may help prolonging the violence on social level. The promises of heritage reconstruction may result in leaving some heritage sites in rubble, as what happened to heritage sites in Hama in the aftermath of the Muslim Brotherhood uprising of 1980s, when Syria's Ba'ath opted to leave parts of the city in ruins until 2005. The post-war reconstruction of Syria's heritage may not have a positive effect on ancient cities, instead, perhaps constituting a continuation of the destructive process by creating a new identity for the site and thereby erasing a specific part of the collective memory. The long history of archaeology in the Middle East, and particularly in Syria, as a state-sponsored discipline, means that reconstruction or excavation works are rarely free of political motivations or influences. Contemporary heritage destruction may indeed be seen as another new chapter in the life cycle of Syria's heritage. Once post-war reconstruction starts, questions about the destruction will be answered. The clearing of rubble and the subsequent reconstruction plans will be selectively implemented to force specific narratives, legends, histories, and heritage to be excluded or included from the rebuilding of the post-war Syrian nation. By then, it's possible that no one will observe the disappearance of material evidences of several historic layers, such as the Greek, Roman, Umayyad, or even Abbasid eras. For instance, the post-war reconstruction plan of Syria has included a new project that focuses solely on re-erecting statues of Hafez al-Assad, which were toppled during Syria's 10 years armed conflict. This rebuilding plan aims to establish a new ideological narrative to revive the cult of personality of Syria's modern-day builder, Hafez al-Assad. This post-war ideology, which is embodied in the restored statue of Hafez al-Assad in Aleppo, introduces a new terminology to describe Hafez al-Assad as the founding leader, instead of the immortal leader. This attempt to describe Hafez al-Assad as the founding leader resembles the endeavor of North Korea's dictator, Kim Jong-un, to strengthen his rule over North Korea by calling his grandfather, Kim II-sung, as the founding leader who was able to establish a dynasty that built modern-day North Korea. It can be argued that the Assad family aims to establish a similar dynasty amidst the destruction to maintain ruling Syria. What I argue here is the possibility that less preservation in the present could allow us for more engagement with memories of the past, but in the future. Destructive actions ultimately create new representations and reinterpretations of cultural heritage, even creating a new form of it, which has not previously emerged or materialized, such as war memorials, urban architecture, or even mass tourism. The importance of understanding archaeological heritage as a finite resource and not replaceable should be deeply investigated. Otherwise, any destruction of heritage or any destruction of archaeological heritage could simply be justified with the ability of modern-day technology to rebuild what has been destroyed. In other words, the destroyed parts of Palmyra, Busra, the old city of Aleppo, and the forgotten northern villages in northern Syria will keep fulfilling their duty of being witnesses to the history of the region and of Syria in particular. Consequently, their value will not be forgotten after their destruction. Post-conflict rebuilding of heritage could result in a political amnesia, something that could bury and or erase specific histories for the sake of forgetting the memories of Syria's war. It has been, therefore, my aim in this talk to clarify how the ongoing destruction of cultural heritage in Syria is writing new episodes of Syrian collective memory. Therefore, the inclusion of wartime memories in the post-war heritage reconstruction could help the healing process of the fragmented Syrian society. The future process of heritage making could demonstrate how heritage is in a constant process of transformation, which may ultimately participate in rebuilding the nation's identity in the aftermath of war. Ever since I started my PhD, I decided to ask my audience after every presentation not to upload me, and in order to make a pause for questions or for the next speaker, or for the pause for the lunch, I would like to ask you for 3 seconds of silence to consider the impact of conflict, not only on heritage and stones and archaeology, but on over 10 million Syrians who were displaced from their homes, and over 500,000 persons lost their lives seeking for refuge. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much, Nour, for that very timely and thought-provoking reminder of the many political, social aspects of the context within which we all work as archaeologists of the Middle East. These are issues we need to keep to the front of our minds all the time. So thank you so much for rounding off the keynote session.
Thank you for having me. It's a great honor.
Pleasure. I would now like to close the plenary session by expressing my sincere thanks to all the keynote speakers for their important and stimulating lectures, and to the preceding plenary speakers and presenters for their kind and generous welcoming speeches, as well as for the poetry and musical contributions. My sincere thanks also go to the very professional work of the team at Hybrida, who've kept us all firmly on track through this morning's plenary sessions. We now have a recess for a break until sessions resume at 1400 CET. So time now for breakfast, lunch, dinner, a midnight snack, or whatever may be appropriate to your time zone and your eating habits. Enjoy the rest of the Congress. Look forward to seeing many of you through the next few days. Thank you and goodbye for now.